History with the Szilagys is recorded on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. This land was ceded to the United States by representatives of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe through the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819. It was ceded, not taken, and the long history of this land and its previous inhabitants cannot be forgotten.
You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagys on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as one of our associate producers with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. Today's topic is the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. The Great Lakes have always been rich in resources and valuable to any who have lived there, and a draw for those who do not. The freshwater lakes and all they contain, of course, but also the thickly forested lower peninsula, the mineral-rich upper, and the good soil of the southern lower have all been appreciated, used, and exploited by the people of Michigan and the surrounding territory. The first Europeans to travel extensively in the Great Lakes area, the French, also exploited the extensive animal resources, nearly hunting the beaver to extinction for the high value of its pelt in Europe. When the French lost the French and Indian War, the extensive territory they held across North America was passed to England, including the Great Lakes region. Located west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Lakes was part of the lands designated to be left to the tribes by the agreements after the French and Indian War under the Proclamation of 1763. British soldiers remained at Fort Michilimackinac in Detroit, as well as other forts through the territory, and authorized traders traveled through the land as they had under the French. Movement into the territory by English colonists, however, was supposed to be limited, and pushback against those who tried to expand beyond that proclamation line was one of the issues that prompted conflict between the colonists and the Crown. When the American colonists overthrew the English, the land which would become Michigan passed to the new United States of America as part of the Northwest Territory. A scheme for organizing the area was designed. It would be divided into territories and then states. Until there was a large enough population in the territory, it would be administered by agents of the federal government. Michigan Territory was carved out of the Indiana Territory on the 30th of June in 1805. But it was not until after the War of 1812 that the Americans could be sure of their borders being respected by the British. This war also ended any aid coming to the American tribes from England, which gave the U.S. a distinct advantage in any negotiations over land ownership. This advantage was exercised as simple removal across much of the continent. But some tribes forced negotiations and worked to get the best terms they could under the circumstances. This was the case with a large swath of Michigan's lower peninsula. On the 12th of September in 1819, a delegation from the Saginaw Chippewa tribe met with Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass to discuss arrangements of land ownership. Cass began the meeting with a speech that demanded the land simply be handed to the United States. The Chippewa refused to give it up without negotiation, and the meeting ended. A few days later, another meeting nearly ended in violence, and would have stopped the discussion altogether had it not been for the intercession of some local fur traders, particularly Jacob Smith. He was well regarded by the tribes of the area, with a reputation for honest dealing and respecting the native traditions and lifeways. He had also been involved with the negotiations around the Treaty of Detroit in 1807, and so was familiar with the issues at hand as well as some of the players. He was seen as a valuable intermediary by both sides, which allowed him to broker the arrangement that returned the Chippewa to the talks. No agreements could be made until the tribe had secured land which would be reserved for their use and living. Once that was settled, and included a small grant of land for Smith himself, the negotiations could continue. The treaty was signed on the 24th of September in 1819. In exchange for approximately 4 million acres, the U.S. government promised an annual payment to the tribe of $1,000 in silver, the right to hunt and fish on the land ceded, and a promise to pay for improvements on the reservation land. As with so many of the treaties between the Native Americans and the United States, it was disproportionate at best and not maintained. However, the Saginaw Chippewa make a point of the fact they negotiated the best they could at the time, and they forced an agreement by which they ceded the land. It was not simply taken from them. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons, Laura Dull and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Our Patreon patrons help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. And you can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on the various socials at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on the socials at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?